before I joined the HE sector, I spent 25 years in retail, which about half that time was spent on developing global supply chains, so dealing with factories in China, India, Eastern Europe, South America, South Africa. And towards the end of that part of my career, I think the focus moved very much onto ethical issues in procurement and supply. And so there's quite a strong theme around the whole ethical, environmental issues in my presentation this afternoon, as you will see. Anyway, moving on, I don't know if you recognise this guy. You might actually be this person. Lots of plate spinning. And I think if this isn't happening in your procurement team at the moment, I think it will be in the future. I think procurement has a big role to play in doing much more than just managing the whole value of what we're buying. I think there's a lot of work developing on the ethical environmental side of things, which each of you may be at some stage in the development of that, but I think that's going to become more of the focus into the future. So in terms of dealing with your internal stakeholders, I think it's important to understand what their issues are. I've got 3 levels here. This is what I see from my role in Manchester Met. Global issues of climate change, and that's a big issue for every organisation, not just the HE sector. My parents' generation have really trashed the environment. I think it's down to the students coming through universities now and everybody else to really try and improve the whole environmental way that business operates. COVID-19, obviously, that's been a big issue right in our faces for the last 15, 16 months or so. But I think 2 years into the future, we might look back on it and just see it as more of a blip than something that's radically changed the way we work. National issues, really driven by politics. I think there's a lot of talk about levelling up or the Northern Powerhouse, depending on which government you're talking to. But I think there's a big piece of work for procurement to do in that. And here we are sitting in our northern universities. I think this is really going to affect us into the future. And then post-Brexit changes. Some of you may be struggling with Incoterms that you've not had to deal with in the past. If you're sitting in a Northern Irish university, you might be struggling with importing sausages, which seems to be top of Boris Johnson's agenda at the moment, or his debates. I don't mean to be flippant. I think there are some significant issues around importing and moving goods around within the UK and EU. Sector issues, I think the big issue for me as a finance director will be the changes that come about through Augur. The Augur report is probably 2 years old now, and you're starting to see the government implement some parts of it. So there's a white paper out at the moment dealing with financing the FE sector. I think the big changes for HE will come through in the autumn spending statement later this year. And as ever, it's likely to mean less money rather than more money. So as ever, for any sector, for any university, there's a challenge in making sure our income remains high. The other side of the equation is our costs. We've had fees fixed at 9,250 per student for many years now. So we're seeing no inflationary increase in our income, but we are seeing inflationary increases in our costs. And some costs are increasing faster than inflation, particularly pension costs, and different universities facing different pension issues. So as ever, I think the sector issues are all about balancing the books. And I think that's traditionally perhaps where procurement has been focused, or people think it's been focused. If our income is fixed and our costs are going up, how can we buy better? How we can get better value from our purchases? But if I step back from the HE sector, and if you ask me a question as just a finance director, what are the big issues? I would say ESG. Now this is an interesting new acronym. I asked 2 colleagues in procurement earlier this week what they thought about ESG, and neither of them knew what I was talking about. So E is environmental, S is social, and G is governance. And they said, oh, that's sustainability. So I think it's perhaps a new term for things we're already working on. I think it perhaps is a bit wider than pure sustainability. And I think sustainability as a term has been used quite widely. It's become a bit fuzzy at the edges. Certainly it's much less focused than it was when I started using the word sustainability 25 years ago. So I think ESG is the biggest theme. I can't pick up any sort of briefing on finance. Every morning in my inbox, I've got reports coming in dealing with ESG. And just to show how big ESG is, this was a headline from yesterday's FT. So PwC to add 100,000 staff over 5 years and to invest 12 billion in supporting their ESG consultancy. So they're seeing work in this area, whether you call it sustainability, whether you call it ESG, work in this area is going to ramp up enormously into the future. So putting an ESG structure to this, I think on the environmental side, procurement has a role to play in all these areas. So for any university, certainly for Manchester Met, our biggest contribution to CO2 emissions is the energy we put into our buildings. So what can we do with that? Palm oil is a big issue. You may not understand what the issues are with palm oil, but if you look at the ingredients on just about any piece of processed food, you'll find palm oil in there somewhere. If you go back to the Stern review of probably 15 years ago, which was the first big global review of what was causing climate change, deforestation, I think, accounts for over 20% of carbon emissions. And one of the biggest causes of deforestation is switching land over from virgin rainforest to oil palm plantations. And certainly if you fly over parts of Southeast Asia, you just see mile after mile of oil palm plantations. So there's some real challenges there. Travel, I've got it in the environmental side of things. There's an environmental footprint of travel, but just as equally, it could be in the social or governance columns, and I'll come back to that. Modern slavery, you probably all have a modern slavery statement on your website. You may be checking your suppliers for their modern slavery statements and their policies, but do we really understand modern slavery? And there's coverage in the financial press today of Boohoo, which is a very successful online retailer. They had a modern slavery statement. They've always had a modern slavery statement since the Act came into force. But you only have to go as far as Leicester in their supply chain to find factories they're using where they're not paying the minimum wage and really abuse of the workers in those factories. So modern slavery is out there. Statements all very well, but do we actually understand our supply chain enough to make sure there's no slavery in there? Levelling up agenda, we've touched on. I think supporting local businesses is something we can all do more of. I think that's quite exciting, but comes with its own challenges. Student outcomes, I'll come back to that. That was a surprise to me when we were able to do something on student outcomes using our procurement team. That's quite exciting. And then there's the whole governance area. And we've seen new procurement regulations coming through. We're now coping with some of the issues of international trade. And underpinning that, there's the whole classic price quality service balance to make sure we're getting value for money for everything that we buy. So as a finance director, I'm really leaving these areas to you as procurement professionals. I don't particularly want to get involved in the governance side of things. Governance is hugely important. I think you only have to look at some of the government procurement early on in the pandemic. Some of that has been proven to be just using your best mates to help them as much as help the nation. But you're the experts on getting the right balance between price, quality and service. So those are areas I don't particularly want to focus on today. Let's take these two, modern slavery and palm oil. The issues here are really in the depths of your supply chain. I think you're unlikely to find modern slavery in your tier 1 suppliers, but go to tier 2, tier 3. Is there modern slavery out there? Any of the food that you're buying, do you really know where the palm oil that's in it is coming from? And this is just a tip of the iceberg. There's all sorts of other issues in your supply chain. It's very difficult to get a clear understanding of a supply chain in university, and just give you this as an example of where I've come from and where I'm now at within the university. So 15 years ago, I was running a business which was buying about £1 billion worth of consumer products from about 300 suppliers. So that's roughly £3 million per supplier. And that sort of volume, I can afford to get auditors on the ground in the factories, looking at the supply chains, making sure there's no abuse, making sure the raw materials are coming from sustainable sources. I'm now at a university where we're managing about 80 million of purchases through our procurement team. We've got about 5,000 suppliers. Not all those are live suppliers. The real figure might be less than that, but the average about £16,000 of purchases per supplier. That doesn't give me the scale to have any auditors actually looking at the supply chain in any great detail. And that's a challenge for all of us. And I think part of the solution, I don't know what the solution is at this stage, but part of the solution, I think, is the sector working together. And I think we do that very well. And I think the procurement consortia are part of that. Part of the solution is using technology so we can see our supply chain in greater detail than we have been able to in the past. And there are examples of where we're trying to do something. So I think both the procurement consortia are members of Electronics Watch, and I think some universities have individual membership. And that's really trying to make sure that the employment practices in the electronic supply chain are suitable and appropriate for us. And I know TUCO have been working on sustainable palm oil, and I looked at their website. I see I think they're actually members now of the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. So the problem's recognised, but I'm not sure we've really found a solution. And certainly from experience, I think certification schemes can be rather lacking. And there was this report that I picked up from Greenpeace a few months ago, which talks about certification schemes to protect the rainforests. So it's dealing with things like FSC, which deals with sustainable timber, and RSPO, Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, which is looking at making sure palm oil comes from sustainable sources. And the Greenpeace report shows that these certification schemes don't work. So what's the solution? It's difficult to know. I think RSPO for palm oil is useful, but I don't think it gives us the full picture of what's going on. And we need to find some way of really getting into our supply chain, really burrowing down into it and understanding what's absolutely going on. But that's going to be a challenge into the future. Then looking at CO2 emissions, certainly for us, that's the biggest part of our carbon footprint. Manchester as a city is committed to be carbon neutral by 2038. The university has made its own commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by the same date, so we're all in the same boat. We could actually be carbon neutral by next year if we wanted to be. All we have to do is switch our power supply to a sustainable source. Well, that comes at a cost. So I think there's a challenge here for procurement teams to look at ways of buying energy from sustainable sources in a way that is affordable to universities. Now, some universities have deeper pockets than others. Some will find it easier to make that switch. But I think perhaps by working together, there might be benefits that we can squeeze out of the supply chain for electricity. Some universities are in different positions. I know University of Lancaster, if you drive up the M6, they have a wind turbine on the other side of the M6, and that must be generating some useful amounts of energy. I don't know if there's anybody from Lancaster on the call today, but be interested to know how that works. That's not available certainly to us in Manchester. If we stuck up a wind turbine in the middle of Manchester, that would raise a few eyebrows. But we do need to be working hard on carbon neutrality and sustainable energy sources. Travel, as I've said, I think can fit under the environmental side of things. So reducing our carbon footprint on travel, moving people to more environmentally friendly ways of travelling. It could be under the social column as well. There's a headline in the FT a few weeks ago on a Monday saying it's Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Do you know where all your employees are? And I think this is more of a challenge, certainly as lockdown restrictions come off, people will start to travel more. Certainly people might be working in different places. If you find people are traveling to countries and suddenly there's an issue there, it might be a health issue, it might be a security issue, you might want to get them out. If you don't know where they are, how can you help to bring them out? Are you actually supporting, looking after their safety and security? On the governance side, we're finding at Manchester Met that we're having more and more people working in more different countries, and that can create tax exposures. If we have enough people spending enough nights in China, then we start to be facing tax risks in China. We need to manage that. So I think there's a role for procurement when it comes to sourcing travel providers to make sure that it's not just a cost that we're managing, it's not just an environmental issue we're managing, we're also looking after our staff, and we're also looking after the governance side of things, particularly around tax. And then finally, on levelling up, this is always quite exciting. I love dealing with entrepreneurs, supporting local businesses, local entrepreneurs. I think universities are big organisations in their own locality. They have a lot of buying power, and there's a lot of work we can do to support local businesses. That might come with its own challenges. Small suppliers perhaps have the same issue we have with really understanding our supply chain. So it might be that a local supplier is dealing with local producers and it's actually easy to monitor that supply chain. But if a small supplier is actually tapping into a global supply chain, that'd be even more of a risk when it comes to issues like modern slavery. So I think there's some challenges there, but it's always very exciting dealing with local business people and really trying to help them develop. And the thing that I've really enjoyed over the last 12, 18 months at Manchester Met is the work we've been doing on helping our students. So some of our suppliers are now committing in new contracts to provide work experience opportunities, summer placements, all sorts of things which can really help our students develop and go out into the world with a degree, but also some work experience, and perhaps get jobs in the local area. And I think if we've got local entrepreneurs, we're providing them with well-trained employees that will really help with the development of the local economy and the levelling up between the north and the south in this country. So that's more or less it. I just got one final slide. I think for the last, well, certainly through most of my career, we've been travelling down this road and then we've been turning right, really trying to drive the economy onwards. But I think over the last 12, 15 months, the COVID pandemic has perhaps focused people's minds more on levelling up and getting greater equality through the economy. So I think if we want to remain sane, we can't just focus on economic issues. We've got to focus on the whole ESG agenda. So perhaps as we go down this road and meet the T-junction, perhaps in the future we'll be turning left and following ducks to a more sane way of working rather than just focusing on the economics. So that's what I wanted to say. I'm quite happy to sort of open up and take questions or comments on that.
Thank you, Andrew. So any questions for Andrew? I have a question, Andrew, around so the challenges of considering ESG and the wants and needs of our academic colleagues when we're providing a procurement service to them. How do we balance that?
I think it's a matter of raising the ESG or the profile of ESG across the university. I think it'll take a bit of time. I think the fact that I've used those initials within the university setting and people didn't recognise it means it'll take some time for that to settle in. But I think if people have been using the word sustainability for the same aims, I think it's a matter of just raising the profile of sustainability issues while also dealing with the whole value proposition as well. So I think it'll take time. I think it'll move over time, but I think as more and more people talk about it, I think it'll be easier in the future.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions for Andrew? Okay, if you do have any questions, if you pop them through and we can get an answer back from Andrew at a later date, so that's absolutely fine.